So very warm welcome from on behalf of EASA. Mung-Ching, thank you very much for having us here and to share some thoughts about sustainable aviation fuel. So today I won't talk too much about technologies and feedstocks, even though I would like to. Today I would like to put a little bit more attention on how we could make it happen. So what's the big challenge in order to ramp up sustainable aviation fuels? So what kind of stakeholders we do see in the field, what it could be their contribution. And so that's it. To start right away, there was a very important quote of your chairman today. So a sustainable aviation fuel is something that can't be measured in currencies. So there's not a market, so it's not a natural market. There's no supply and demand because there's a strong need for sustainable aviation fuel. The need is because Mother Earth tells us that the climate is changing dramatically and sustainable aviation fuels is the one, if not the most important lever for decarbonized aviation. And today I would like to tackle three questions. So first of all, I would like to go a little bit into details why we have this challenge of affordability and availability of sustainable aviation fuels. Second, I would like to talk a little about the SAF value chain. What do we see at the moment? So we have been working on many projects currently that are ramping up. But in order to do a test trial or the test flight from one Asian city to another, maybe you have to import a HEFA-based sustainable aviation fuel from Porvoo refinery from Nest in Finland. So nowadays, just recently, the refinery opened up in Singapore, but before you had to import this fuel from Finland in order to make it happen here. The same is true in Africa. Yeah? Kenya Airlines just recently made their first flight on sustainable aviation fuel. Guess where it's coming from? It's coming from an Italian refinery from Eni. So meaning that it's not a market. It's something that's at the beginning. Therefore, we would like to really stress this moment and the initial challenge of it about availability and affordability, and especially what all the stakeholders across the value chain can contribute to make it happen. And last but not least, I would like to talk a little bit about policies, partnerships, and about financing incentives, because these are three levers that are of pivotal importance to make it happen. So first of all, the good news, we know what it needs, sustainable aviation fuel. But what's sustainable aviation fuel? Do we talk about recycled carbon fuels? Do we talk about low carbon fuels? Do we talk about HEFA-based, waste to liquid, power to liquid? So it's really a complex topic of different technologies, different regulations worldwide. We're talking about mandates, incentives. We talk about the stick and carrot system of the US versus the EU in terms of regulation. So it's quite a complex topic. But there's one truth in it. Sustainable aviation fuel in all of the studies that you'll see. If it's a long-term aspirational goal of ICAO, if you look at the World Economic Forum, if you look at Waypoint, it's sustainable aviation fuel. By all means, we can talk about operational efficiency. You can drive it to the utmost. We will need sustainable aviation fuel in the future to decarbonize the aviation sector. So, and this is also true in terms of alternative technologies. Even though electric flying and hydrogen flying will become mature. So, for example, Norwegian Airways just recently said by 2040, all short-haul flights will be done on electrical airplanes, meaning all flights up to 1.5 hours. So this is quite a big opportunity, but nevertheless, for long haul, also in the long term, sustainable aviation fuel will be the pivotal mean in order to decarbonize. The good news about it, it's a drop-in compatibility fuel, so the fueling system at the airports and the engines is eligible to accept it. But now let's talk about the challenge. So we have two challenges. First of one, it's the availability, and second one is affordability. Let's talk about first of the availability. I just talked about the Porvoo refinery in Neste shipping HEFA-based fuels here to Asia or to Kenya. So currently, in terms of what kind of projects are announced, and I'm talking about project announced, only 1 out of 10 projects are getting to FID. Just recently, Shell just had a negative FID in Singapore for the refinery. Neste opened the refinery. But if we sum up all those projects, we come up with 30 million tons of SAF in 2030. Comparing this to the overall amount, depending on the growth rate, depending on substitute travel modes, it's comparable very, very low. So we're talking about 5 to 7% of SAF available. So for the next 5 years, airlines are very well teached in order to get access to SAF, because it will be a short market. And it won't be an open market. I expect that it won't be a liquid market. It will be by bilateral agreements between different projects, different productions and all fuel producers and suppliers and the airlines. On the other side, looking at prices, I would recommend to be very cautious about price developments of sustainable aviation fuel. In my mind, there will never a price parity. In my team, we have a lot of chemicals. They tell me it's physically not possible that sustainable aviation fuel becomes in price parity of fossil fuel. And especially also, there are a lot of forecasts about going down prices for sustainable aviation fuel. If feedstock suppliers become aware of how valuable their feedstocks are, then all economies of scale and learning curves will be offset by those expectations in terms of rising prices of feedstocks. And we already see it for used cooking oil. So then we move on a little bit to the producer and to the airline perspective, talking about the finance challenge. In order to make it happen, to decarbonize until 2050, we need $1 trillion to be invested, meaning we're talking about 100 to 120 billion every year to be invested. This is a huge amount in a nascent market, which is regulatory driven, and it's only something that Mother Earth is telling us that's a good thing to do. It has no economic reason in the first sense. Second, from a producer perspective, it's technological, commercial, and there are project implementation risk. I'm not so much talking about HEFA. HEFA in the short term is the way to produce SAF, but I'm talking about power to liquid, I'm talking about waste to liquid, I'm talking about combination of power and biomass to liquid. All those technologies that are currently in infant stage and becoming commercially, these are very much risk. And those banks, they need to secure a bankability of those projects. And what do they do in order to minimize the risk? It's about getting offtake agreements. Airlines, you know better than me, they are procuring fuel on a yearly basis. They're hedging a little bit. And now there's a SAF producer of a new technology coming up. I would like you to underwrite a 10 years commitment of taking off my SAF, where I already know the second plant in line will be cheaper than my first plant, but I would like to pay you this price for the next 10 years. Imagine the CFO to put that on the balance sheet. It's almost impossible. And that's the producer perspective. On the other side, you have the airline perspective. There's a lot of discussions currently going on in Europe in order to educating consumers and the people who are flying about more SAF awareness and a willingness to pay. And sure, business customers are more prepared in order to pay for the premium than private customers are doing. So, but how to finance the SAF premium in order to fulfill sustainability goals and mandates? And finally, what I already said, which airline is prepared in order to put a 10 years offtake agreement on its balance sheets? And not only for one plant, but only for several plants. So that's a little bit the financial challenge that we are facing at the moment. It's an industry and a product. We know what it needs, but the financing to put everything together is a big, big challenge. So looking a little bit about the value chain of SAF, it's from the feedstocks, about the crude production, refining. You can use existing refinery infrastructure, converting it to biorefineries. You can co-process. You can make fossil refineries more green by green hydrogen. Distribution logistics, you need the blending. I'm not talking about different SAF types with the different blending rates, but you have them. You see the airports and the airlines. And I've highlighted 4 parties that I think are of pivotal importance. The current landscape for SAF production is very much driven by startups. You see small companies like, not even small companies, but companies that are more and more developing like LanzaJet, going for the alcohol to jet pathway. You see Fulcrum from the States or Waste Fuel in the Philippines going for waste to liquid. You see power and biomass to liquid from Sasol and Uniper in Norway. But these are very much startup-driven projects. So what it needs, and when we see at the financing numbers, it's big business. And therefore, I see the oil and gas companies here in the lead because they have the control over existing infrastructure. They have the logistics in place. They have the lever to invest and also the financial means. Everything is a little bit about feedstocks, yeah? About hydrogen, for example. You can use hydrogen directly. You could use hydrogen for other things. You could use cooking oil in order to produce renewable diesel. And that's something that has to be somehow also managed and mitigated by regulation that the right feedstocks are used for different kind of fuels in the future. Second, we see about the airlines. So there need to be some kind of price commitments in the future for making projects bankable. Airlines must become more involved in the production of SAF, at least for a short term. We'll talk later on about partnerships. We see airlines already going into equity positions of SAF fuel producers. We see them investing into plants. We see them to sign those offtake agreement with a certain term and timeline. Maybe also airlines becoming more engaged in DevEx, so in the development expenditures of such projects. And it's a task about airlines in order to create more and more awareness among their customers that SAF is something that the whole nation, the whole society must be interested in. And that's also a big discussion also between a developing world, or meaning a world where flying is more used to and more accessible to a broad part of the society, and countries, especially also in Africa, where a large portion of the society has not been accessible to flying. And therefore, regulation has to be very, very much sensible in order to address that too. Third, regulatory policies and bodies. Government support is of pivotal necessity in order to make SAF make it happen. And here we see that SAF producers, what they tell me is those regulations have to be reliable. They have to be stable. Because if I do such an investment, it takes me 4 years to build such a plant, and the lifetime of such a plant is at least 20 years. So my financial case goes over 20 years. If regulation changes every 4 years, then I can hardly calculate what that return brings me. And then I have not only a bankability problem, but I have also a return problem. Last but not least, it comes back to project financing. So who is financing projects who have a large technology risk, a commercial risk, implementation risk, but they are desperately needed? So here we need more and more development banks and non-refundable loans, accessible funds, in order to match that gap. We see, for example, the Canadian State Fund who is giving non-refundable loans to SAF projects, or the EU Innovation Fund. So there are a lot of means into place. We come to that later. So taking a little bit the perspective of airlines. What are airlines doing in terms of SAF? How to make it happen? And here you see a little bit, it's a little bit a theoretical problem. We make it more practical in a minute. So we see airlines putting it into their strategy and corporate policy, like Mung-Ching said today, about SAF commitments in the future. We see customer services and self-obligations, financial capabilities exposure, and sourcing engagement level and intensity. And here airlines are becoming more and more engaged. So we see airlines from Alaska Airlines, ATR, Deutsche Post, who are really committed in using SAF. Deutsche Post DHL, for example, has said that they will use 25% of SAF of their whole fuel consumption in 2030. Same is true for Delta Airlines. They said they are committed to use 35% SAF usage by 2035. Cathay Pacific, just as an example, they bought into Falcon Bioenergy. Falcon Bioenergy is one of the leaders in waste to liquid. gasifying municipal solid waste, which is also an interesting option, I think, for some Asian countries. We see, for example, an international airlines group committed almost $1 billion in order to purchasing SAF over the next 20 years. So these are very strong signals to the market that there is a market and that producer can actually rely on it, that there will be demand and that this product will be taken. So first, then I would like to move over to policies first. And here, on the left side, you see the current landscape of different regulations popping up all over the world. There's a little bit a different philosophy between, for example, Europe and the US. It's a little bit the stick and carrot paradigm. So EU is very much on mandates, and the US is very much on incentives. So blender's tax rate, low carbon fuel standard, and so on. It's very much on giving financial incentives in order to get those projects a good positive financial return. But there are others coming up. For example, Japan just said that they are going to introduce a mandate. Turkey is going to use it. Then we have Canada, we have Brazil. So there's a very moving regulation landscape worldwide. And on the right side, I've just given you the example of the EU, of the Refuel EU. And here they have a mandate overall up to 2050. Oil producers, so here they call, in German, they call them Inverkehrsbringer. So the producer and fuel suppliers, they are obliged to have 70% of SAF in the fuel mix. And there's a sub-quota of it, of 35% of an e-fuel mandate. And that's a little bit something special. When I'm here in Asia and especially also in Latin America, when I speak to the people, it's very much on biofuels. We're talking about used cooking oil, we are talking about virgin oils. Everyone is asking me, virgin oil, under which regulatory scheme is it eligible? But in Europe, it's a little bit different because we don't have so much used cooking oil. And if you are ramping up your SAF production, there won't be any more for Europe. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But Europe is very much, and here you see the reflection of feedstock availability and about technologies. And it's about power and power to liquid. And the regulator somehow said that in the long term, power to liquid is the only technology pathway that is unlimited in terms of feedstocks, renewable electricity and CO2. And therefore, we have the sub-mandate. It's starting in 2025 with a 2% overall. It's going up to 70% in 2050, and the same is true for the sub-quota in e-fuel. Furthermore, I've just highlighted three other aspects. For example, HEFA. Europe is discussing a cap on used cooking oil-based HEFA, 1.7% in the total fuel mix. And here you really see the influence of regulators on what kind of technology pathways and feedstocks should be promoted and for which I would like to artificially create markets. And that's a very interesting discussion, especially also for the Asian context. How open you would like to be in order for which kind of technology pathways and which kind of feedstocks you would like to promote, or which kind of should be the basis for your future SAF production. Because there's a strong competition for ethanol, there's a strong competition for UCO, to produce renewable diesel, as I said, or to produce other chemicals. So everything is very much interlinked. Europe has decided that power to liquid is one of the most important ones, and that it should be incentivized in order to invest in those markets. Third, about policies, it's about other frameworks. And here I'm talking about the airline industry, about the self-commitments. And here I would like just to mention one of those science-based targets initiatives. A lot of airlines, already 26, have committed to those goals, which are aligned to the Paris Agreement, in order to reduce their emissions reference to the 2019 reference level well above 2%. And this is quite an amazing overview of airlines already committed in order to make SAF as one mean happen. Besides policies, I think the second lever in order to make SAF happen are cross-industry partnerships. Before, it was quite clear the procurement department of an airline purchased SAF, purchased fuel. But nowadays, the landscape becomes more and more diverse. And you see here just some examples, and I've put here the different technologies. So you see HEFA technologies, but you also see power to liquid, biomass to liquid, and waste to liquid, even sun to liquid processes. And you see, in order to make it happen, you not only have takeoff agreements by the shaking hands, but you also see those change, meaning that airlines are prepared to invest in those companies, to invest in those production sites. And that's quite amazing if you see all those different future players. So Neste, of course, as a very much established player, is now has made very bold decision 10 years ago because they are based, or they are still also operating fossil refineries, up to companies like I already said, Norsk e-Fuel, a power to liquid, where Norwegian has invested, or Falcrom, waste to liquid, where Cathay Pacific invested, Sky Energy, where KLM invested. So this is really where equity is going into SAF production in order to secure SAF access for those airlines. Finally, I would like to talk a little bit about financing incentives, the need for funding, what I already said. There's a big need in order to get money into financing those projects and those companies. I'm just highlighting those three at the upper part. There are other means on the lower part of demand and enabling SAF markets, which I would not touch upon today. So here we have a kind of funds that are currently supporting research and development, but also deployment of SAF. I'm talking about the EU Innovation Fund, which is supporting up to 3-digit million amounts in different projects all over Europe, power to liquid in Norway or other means in the south of France. We see the Canadian Strategic Innovation Fund. So these are really big money givers in order to fund those projects. Second, we see means and incentives, tax relief via capital grants, loan guarantees in order to support the SAF supply infrastructure. We see that, for example, US states are giving bonds to SAF producers, very dedicated, in order to build up those companies as future leaders, for example, Falcrom. And you have some other targeted initiatives, tax relief, like I already said, the blender's tax rate, feedstock subsidies, where you have a fixed amount of US dollar per gallon produced, meaning that's a very income that's bankable. And that's what I said at the beginning. It's very important for those companies that those projects become commercially bankable. And imagine that with RIN certificate, with a blender's tax credit, and all the others in the states. Therefore, the states are very much incentive business, and the business case becomes very much stable, and investors are prepared to invest. Different strategy in Europe, going for mandates, forcing people in order to invest. So these are just three kind of financing means in order to make it happen. To sum it up, what does it need from our perspective in order to build SAF roadmaps on the left side? There are three goals. Expansion of supply and use, what we have already seen. We need a lot of innovation in order to reduce the cost of producing SAF. And we need the enhancement of SAF sustainability. Because you can value SAF in very different ways. And I'm coming back to what I initially said. What's SAF? So there are low carbon fuels, recycled carbon fuels. Recycled carbon fuels from a regulation perspective is if you use fossil waste, fossil plastic in order to be used, and makes this thing not easier. And therefore, you have to value, or what we think in the future is that there will be a kind of merit order of different SAF types to be produced. Because with PTL, you can achieve almost 99% greenhouse gas emission reduction. With HEFA, it's around about between 65 to 80. So is this valued in regulation? Currently not. It's in Europe, it's more volume driven. But we think that in the future, different pathways and different types of SAFs will have a different value. So the building blocks is always, where we start, is always about feedstock innovation. So you have to think about your feedstock that you have, and the feedstock also in the future about their limits and their expansion potentials. Then you have to talk about conversion technology innovation. Like I said, HEFA, that's a solution for me for the short term. But in the future, you have to have a technology mix in your countries. You have to have waste to liquid. You have to have power to liquid. And you have to import those technologies or to develop by your own. And you have to build this first supply chains from the feedstock up to the airplane in order to use SAF as a starting point. Finally, you need the policies in order to enabling the end use. And just I would like to conclude with 3 key messages at the end. So first, there's no way around sustainable aviation fuel. It's a common approach. It needs all stakeholders across the value chain. And I think it's something that all of us should be aware. There's no economic currency for SAF. SAF has a broader sense. It's something what I already said. Mother Earth is telling us, and we should do it for our children and the children's children, because there's only one Earth that we have, and we should be very careful in treating it. Second, it's not a task of an airline alone. It's not a task of one producer alone. It's a task of society. It's a task of partnership. It's a task of value chain and cross-industry partnerships. And second, it needs governmental support. And I don't think that there will be a price parity. SAF will come at a cost. Someone has to pay it. Consumers have to pay it. Producers have to pay it. Everyone has to have a certain burden, but it needs government support at least in order to have a starting point. It needs the cross-industry partnerships in order to make it happen. Thank you very much.